we're going to get our evening started. I'm just making a very brief introduction. First of all, I'd like to say I'm coming to you from Yuin country this evening. Ordinarily, I would be in Durrawal, but I have had to make the decision to leave my family to look after my mum during COVID. I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this beautiful land that I am on, which is the south coast of New South Wales. It's absolutely beautiful down here, and it's easy to see that people have looked after this beautiful land for tens of thousands of years. Now, this very brief introduction is to say welcome to a presentation from We Are Hughes. This is part of our Informed series. As you know, our three tenets are integrity, informed, inclusive. Part of being informed is us listening to the constituents and being informed by the constituents, and equally constituents being informed by experts. When we have our own elected member, we would like to call this like an information loop from the member to the constituents through the experts, but keeping people informed all the time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Josh, who will give our acknowledgement, and then Annalise will take over the proceedings. But a special thank you to all our expert presenters this evening. It's wonderful that you've come here to share your knowledge with us. Thank you very much. Josh, can you please give our acknowledgement?
Thank you, Linda, and welcome everyone to our event this evening. I'd like us all, as always, to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the beautiful lands we are fortunate to meet on today. I understand this is a Zoom meeting, so we are coming to each other from a range of different countries, different nations, different languages. I'm talking to you from Wiradjuri country, and I acknowledge them as the traditional owners of the land that I am on. We Are Hughes, and we as a group pay our respects to all Indigenous elders past, present and future, and extend those respects to and welcome all Indigenous persons joining us tonight. We Are Hughes acknowledges that this beautiful country always was, always is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. And I'm coming to you from Durrawal land, which is where the majority of the Hughes electorate is from. So if you are from a different part of this country or somewhere else, and you'd like to put that in the chat just to acknowledge the country that you are coming to us from. But I'd like to welcome everyone who's taken the time to be here tonight, especially our esteemed guests, Tim Buckley, Professor Tim Flannery, and Dr Gabrielle Kuiper. My name is Annalise, and I'm from We Are Hughes. One of the biggest things that I'm passionate about is raising awareness about climate change, and that's what brought me to volunteer with We Are Hughes. As many of us know, for too long we've had a federal representative that's not listened to experts on this issue, and I, along with others, have been ashamed countless times when he has made public announcements about how climate change is not happening due to cold weather, for example, that we had today in Sydney. Last year, I had the chance to speak to him about my concerns and pressed him not only on his knowledge of climate change, but his refusal to acknowledge the economic imperative for Australia to join the Green Revolution. This conversation led me to contact Tim Buckley, who's here tonight, from the Institute for Energy, Economics and Financial Analysis, who was very generous with his time in explaining what is happening in the world. After this, I couldn't help but think that I, as a constituent, should not have to speak to the experts to convince my MP of action on climate change. My MP should be consulting the experts and making it happen. Since then, the latest IPCC has been released, increasing the urgency of action on climate change. And we have here tonight the very best in Australia on both of these issues of climate change and the Green Revolution. So I urge you to take the time to listen, to learn and ask some questions. You can send any questions that you have in the chat, and Josh is going to help us at the end of the night to choose some good ones that we can hand over to the panel at the end of the presentation. So right at the end of the night, you'll be able to ask some questions. So if everyone's ready, let's kick it off. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Professor Tim Flannery. Professor Tim Flannery is one of Australia's leading writers on climate change with his most famous book being The Weathermakers in 2005. An internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer, and conservationist, Professor Flannery was named Australian of the Year in 2007. His credentials on the topic of climate change include Professor of the Climate Risk Concentration of Research Excellence at Macquarie University, Chairman of the Copenhagen Climate Council, as well as the first Climate Commissioner of the Australian Climate Commission, now known as the Climate Council. He still holds a position on the Climate Council as Chief Counsellor. We thank Tim for giving us his time tonight and are really looking forward to hearing what he can tell us about the latest IPCC report. Thanks, Tim.
Right. Look, thank you so much, Annalise. I'm calling in this evening from Darug country on the Hawkesbury River, but I'm very pleased to be connecting with people with the We Are Hughes group and people in the Hughes electorate, because I spent some of the happiest years of my life in your electorate down in Janali. My children were born there, my two older children, and grew up there, and we enjoyed the Como Hotel, the Warrenora River, the incredible bushland reserves you have there down in your electorate. And so it's very close to my heart. I think perhaps the big thing that's changed since I was there, I reckon the quality of coffee has got better in the Janelli shops, but a lot of the rest of it is still the same. It's wonderful to see. So what I would like to do this evening really is to try to explain what the IPCC is, how they work, what their latest assessment report has to tell us, and what we should do about it. So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a group not only of climate experts drawn from around the world and run by the UN and the World Meteorological Organization, but also has representatives of governments. So even the government of Saudi Arabia and Russia has a representative on the IPCC panel. And every word that's put in an IPCC report has to be acknowledged and recognised by everyone of that group. All of the political representatives, all of the science representatives have to agree before a word goes into those reports. And as you probably are aware, those reports are thousands of pages long. They're produced once every 7 or 8 years. And what they do is draw together all of the science that's been published over that time. So that can be thousands of scientific papers that have to be brought together, synthesized, and then expressed in a language people can understand and yet remain accurate. So that's the work of the IPCC. This last report that they produced, which was about 2 months ago now, is their 6th assessment report. So it's a 6th report they've produced like this. And reading it, you really get the sense that this report is almost the last warning that the scientists will get to give us. And the reason I say that is because it's clear if you read the report and what they're projecting, that if we don't act within the next decade, many of our actions may be fruitless, because we will cross thresholds in a climate system that will lead to runaway climate change. So when the IPCC produces a report, they don't say, oh, this is going to happen and that's going to happen. They deal, like all scientists do, with probabilities. Yeah. So they say it's highly probable or likely. They have all these terms that equate to, 50-50 or 60-40% probability or 90-10% probability that something is attributable to a particular effect. And if you just read their summary, you'll see that there are hundreds of these, what they call attributions of probability to different events. So they'll say, the Earth is warming, we can observe that, that is absolutely clear and unequivocal, but it's highly likely that it's been caused by the greenhouse gases that we've burnt through the use of fossil fuels. And so on it goes through. So they're very, very detailed. They're very conservative reports. As you can imagine, if the Saudi government representative agrees to it, it's not going to be too radical. So they're pretty, they are conservative reports in that way, and yet they are scientifically accurate. So the last report, what it tells us is that we have put an enormous amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere over the last 15 years. So I was made Australian of the Year 14 years ago now, back in 2007. And since that time, where humanity has put in between 1/4 and 1/3 of all of the greenhouse gases we have ever emitted in the entire history of our species. So that's, we're burning more and more year by year. And as we burn more, the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere grows. So as of this year, we're now at about 412 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That compares with 280 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution began. So the CO2 is increasing, and it's very, very clear scientifically that that's leading to the ocean acidifying, but also quite clear that it's leading to this warming trend. As the warming trend really sets in, we see changes in the climate system that threaten to trigger runaway warming. So one of those trends is the impact of the additional warmth on the Arctic ice. So the Arctic is warming more than twice as fast as the rest of the planet, just the way the Earth system works. And the Arctic ice is reaching record low levels now. If you look at it over time, it's not the same every year. In fact, this year, less ice has melted than in other years, but the general trend is toward record low levels of ice across the Arctic Ocean. And that sort of reinforces the warming because the ice reflects the sunlight that hits it. It's bright, yes, so it reflects sunlight. And that sunlight carries energy away from our planet and back into space. But if that same sunlight hits a dark ocean, it absorbs all of the energy in that sunlight and creates heat. You know yourself, if you go skiing and you've got black ski gloves on, they'll feel warmer than the pale things around you. Yeah, so that's how that works. So, and if we lose enough ice, we'll trigger a runaway effect, which will have a big impact on the Greenland ice cap. And, if the Greenland ice cap melts, we'll have 6 or 7 meters of sea level rise. We can see other trigger points in the loss of forests in the Amazon. The Eastern Amazon, for most of the time people have been looking at it, the Eastern Amazon rainforest, they've been sinks for carbon dioxide. The trees have grown and taken CO2 out of the air and sequestered it in the trees and in the soils. But just recently, it's become a source of carbon dioxide. And that's because of changing weather patterns, increasing rainfall, and the release of carbon as a result of those factors. So, and they come about as a result of the greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere and the fact that people are just clearing and burning a lot of forest in that part of the world. The melting of the permafrost is another one of those trigger points. If we melt too much permafrost, we'll release so much CO2 and methane into the atmosphere that we won't have any way of getting back. We see the ocean currents changing too. They're slowing. The big ocean currents that bring heat to Europe and so forth, they're slowing down, and again as a result of climate change. And if they stop, we will have another driver for runaway climate change. So the warning of the IPCC report and the real take-home message is that we must act now. We need to start reducing our greenhouse gas emissions on the order of 8% a year for the rest of this decade. And by then, hopefully, we'll be largely decarbonised, at least in electricity. And we can then start doing everything else that we need to do. But the urgent issue for the day now is to cut those emissions. And I think my 15 minutes is nearly up, I can see, but it's really important to emphasise that. We also, of course, need to take care of all of the biodiversity that's going to by these rising emissions and rising temperatures. And we also need to seek a way of getting some of the greenhouse gases out of the air. The IPCC tells us that 1.5 degrees is really the upper limit of warming we can tolerate. 2 degrees would be really too dangerous. And yet at the moment, we're heading, probably the best we could get is 1.7, 1.8 degrees. So we need to get some of the greenhouse gas out of the air by growing seaweed or some other means. This is really an issue where government really counts, as you'll see with the big meeting in Glasgow next year. Your government representative has a responsibility to help keep you safe. And that means addressing climate change in a systemic and rational and sensible manner. And this is what we really need. And this is why I'm here tonight, really, with We Are Hughes, to try to just drive home that point that this is the moment for action. And it has to start local. It has to start with us getting good representation in Parliament, people who recognise the urgency of the situation we face. So that's it for now. I will sign off and let the next speaker have their say.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that, that rundown of the latest IPCC report. What I really got from that is a couple of things. The two things: must act now and cut those emissions. And I think that really sums it up, isn't it? Everything that you explained about, where the warming is coming from, including, man-made greenhouse gases, but also those feedback loops that could be triggered if we don't cut these emissions. So if there's one thing that we can take away from that, is must act now and cut those emissions. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to move on now, and everyone will have a chat. I can see some questions already happening in the chat. We will get to those questions at the end, but I do want to just move on. I want to give each of our speakers an opportunity to talk. So we're going to move to Tim Buckley. So let me just do this first. Where did he go? Where are you, Tim? Oh, there you are. There he is. Okay. This is Tim Buckley. Tim Buckley is IEFA's Director of Energy Finance Studies, Australia South Asia, and he has 30 years of financial markets experience covering Australia, Asian and global equities. Tim is a top-rated financial analyst studying the electricity sector and highlights the technology and finance-driven inevitability of a global transition towards a lower emission system. This analysis extends to examine the risks to potentially stranded fossil fuel assets, as well as the resulting opportunities for renewable energy, energy efficiency, renewable hydrogen, and other low carbon finance assets, both in Australia and from a global perspective. And it is my delight to have him here to talk to us about all of those things. And, going on from Tim Buckley's talk, that's the situation that we're in, but here is the hope and the energy that we have in the solutions that are already happening. So I pass you on to Tim Buckley. If I can just ask to unmute. Perfect.
Excellent. Good evening. Thank you, Annalise, for arranging this event, and thank you to the people of We Are Hughes for joining us tonight for this energy transition discussion. Could I add my acknowledgement that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and could I pay my respects to their elders? Despite the glaring anomalies that are evident in our own country and our own political discussion, much of the world is finally, if belatedly, now starting to really move in the right direction at a degree of momentum that's really positively surprising everyone. Even here in Australia, the conversation is shifting from the excuses that the cost of inaction is too high to the growing realization that of the reality of extreme weather events. The evidence to me, to I think most people now in Australia, is the cost of inaction is just way too high. The economic costs, the environmental costs, the social costs. To me, the real pivot, though, from an economic perspective is going to come with the understanding that there are massive, massive opportunities facing Australia as a renewable energy superpower. The huge investment, employment and export opportunities that will come to Australia as we embrace those opportunities. They'll come in the form of green ammonia, green hydrogen, lithium, copper, green aluminium, green iron, value adding of all of our various mineral resources. We've been the quarry to the world. It's time we value add using our huge renewable energy resources. But there's also the professional, technical and knowledge worker opportunities that this will open up as well. So while our federal government is yet to accept the inevitability of the energy transition, Australia is a very internationally trade-exposed economy, and it's how our key trade partners respond to this growing global climate crisis that will determine the direction of Australia. It won't be determined by our politicians, that's for sure, and that gives me a lot of hope. My background is in financial markets, as Annalise said, and the hard proof is increasingly in the financial markets, and that's telling a very, very different story today than what's parroted by our federal politicians. Take the lithium mining sector, for example. Just 5 years ago, there were 5 companies, the top 5 lithium mining companies in Australia had a market capitalisation of under $6 billion. Fast forward to today, their combined market cap is $30 billion. So a 500% increase in just 5 years says that maybe our Prime Minister's comments about how electric vehicles are going to destroy his weekend is just missing the absolute point. The financial markets are telling you exactly the opposite. This is a huge, huge investment opportunity for Australia. And it's interesting to me, I mean, I've long covered Wesfarmers as a company. Back in February of this year, Wesfarmers announced the commitment, the green light for the Mount Holland lithium mine and processing plant over in Western Australia. It's a $2 billion investment in processing and value adding of Australia's lithium resources for export. Now, it's telling to me that Wesfarmers only 4 years ago was in fact one of Australia's largest coal mining companies. Now they mine absolutely no coal, and they're on track to become one of the world's largest lithium ion mining and processing companies. And that's one of Australia's top companies. It's also one of the best performing companies in the last 2 decades. So capital is moving, our Australia's leading companies are moving. And maybe take the Australian Financial Review this week as telling how the financial markets are looking at it. To me, the headline this week in Chanticleer has said it all. And the headline was, how to plug into the resource super cycle. The clean energy revolution, just reading from the first paragraph, the clean energy revolution is driving a tectonic shift away from fossil fuels and into battery minerals, sending share prices skyrocketing. Take another article from last week from the Financial Review. The headline, Investors Stampede Mining's Electrification Frenzy. Surging prices of battery minerals such as lithium are turning ASX minnows into emerging giants almost overnight. Now, this isn't coming from the latest edition of Greenpeace. This is coming from the very conservative financial newspaper, the AFR, and that's this week. They're talking about tectonic shifts, super cycles, and enormous 500% acceleration in market valuations of companies exposed to the future. To me, it's also very reassuring to know that our key global countries that are our export destinations are responding to the overwhelmingly obvious evidence that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more extreme, and that the profound effects on both economics and communities. And as a result, they're pledging to decarbonise, and they're pledging to do it at a momentum that is absolutely staggering versus what we were seeing even 6 or 12 months ago. And global corporates and financial institutions are likewise responding to the increasing to these signals and are increasingly curtailing finance to new fossil fuel projects. Capital flight from the fossil fuel sector is absolutely rampant globally, even though you wouldn't know it in the Australian political scene. It's also, I think, very telling that in a decade of federal government energy policy chaos, Australian consumers are responding to protect themselves. And so 2021 is going to be another record year for rooftop solar installs. Australia is on track to do over 3.5 gigawatts of rooftop solar alone in 2021. And it's great that we've got Dr. Gabrielle Kuiper, who will take us into a lot more detail on that. And it'll just highlight how Australia is already a world leader in this sector. So let me pivot to the global policy shifts that have happened in the last 6 or 12 months, and they are going to have a profound impact on Australia. Start with our biggest trade partner, China. China's pledged to peak emissions by 2030, but what's been missed a lot in the Australian discussion is that China's power sector and their steel sectors have both committed to peak emissions by 2025, and telling for Australia, given China is the world's biggest steel industry. 53% of the world's steel is produced in China. They import huge amounts of Australian coking coal and iron ore, and they've pledged to decarbonise their steel sector by 30% just in the 5 years to 2030. So that's a profound rate of momentum that the Chinese government has pledged to for the steel sector. And let's pivot to Japan. Japan's new energy plan for 2030 was approved in July of this year, 2 months ago, consistent with Prime Minister Suga's pledge in April to cut emissions in Japan by 46% by 2030. In other words, within 9 years. Now, the plan from the Ministry of Economics, Trade and Industry, METI, has called for a 46% reduction in Japanese thermal coal use in their power sector by 2030. A 46% reduction in thermal coal use. And on top of that, they've called for a 51% reduction in LNG use. Now, why am I stressing those two numbers? Japan is Australia's largest export destination for fossil fuels, and the Japanese government's pledged to halve their use of both thermal coal and LNG in the next 9 years. That's going to have profound implications on our export sectors, irrespective of what Scott Morrison does and doesn't do. South Korea has likewise committed to a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030, and it's no surprise to me, South Korea is on track to install over 4 gigawatts of solar this year, matching the record high they did last year of 4.1 gigawatts. And South Korea earlier this year announced a project for offshore floating wind, 6 gigawatts of offshore wind in a single project, $40 billion of investment. So 5 times bigger than the world's biggest investment in wind, offshore wind in the world to date. And that's South Korea, Australia's second largest export destination for thermal coal and LNG. Shifting to the European Union, we've heard a fair bit of discussion in the Australian press about how Europe is now actively working towards introduction of the carbon border adjustment mechanism from 2023. And that momentum, it continues to build dramatically, which means the growing realization that that will have a profound impact on Australian exporters, particularly if other nations follow Europe's lead. And that's where I expect the momentum to really build in the next 12 months. It's also telling the EU emissions trading scheme, their carbon price has doubled in the last 12 months to 60 euros, an all-time record high of 60 euros hit just this month. It's up 100% in a year. It's up 500% in 5 years. So European industry, European economy, the economy and the European people are clearly acting on climate change in a way that we've never seen before. And I'll pivot to the US, because the US for 4 years was showing the same irresponsibility as Australia. But now in the last, since the election of President Biden, we've started to see a really, really strong return to global leadership from the US on climate action. And the momentum's building with every week, every month over in the US. In April 2021, President Biden confirmed his target that the US electricity system will be carbon-free by 2035, 14 years from now, and the entire US electricity system will be carbon-free. That's the pledge from the US president. Now, it's really interesting to me, America has 500 gigawatts of gas-fired power plants, and President Biden saying every one of those will either have to install CCS or outright close within 14 years. And on top of that, they'll exit coal entirely as well. That's a profound shift that is expected to happen in the next 15 years, according to the biggest country in the world. And meanwhile, Australia is sitting in denial. Shifting to India, Prime Minister Modi in August announced that a national hydrogen strategy as part of India's target for energy independence by 2047. And so Prime Minister Modi is absolutely focused on removing and ending India's fossil fuel import dependence by the 100-year anniversary of independence from England. So that's a pretty major milestone that Prime Minister Modi announced only a month ago. So I just wanted to highlight there is huge global momentum in key countries around the world. The global financial system has likewise shown phenomenal progress in 2021. The UN convened Financial Alliance for Net Zero Emissions by 2050 is I think, another profound shift. So financial institutions around the world with a collective $88 trillion of assets have pledged to 1.5 degrees. Now, that is a profound shift in the goalpost relative to even what they were talking about only 6 months ago when they were pledged to the Paris alignment, which meant 2 degrees limit. And so that is a more than halving of the remaining carbon budget. And I wouldn't really want to bet against financial institutions that collectively manage $88 trillion of capital globally. And maybe to pick on one financial institution we at IEFA have been following very closely, BlackRock's Larry Fink has talked repeatedly this year about the seismic reallocation of capital, and he forecasts that is coming with an amazing speed, and ESG fund flows are at a record high globally. So environmental, social and governance fund flows are hitting record highs every month in the last 18 months. And so later this month, I'm doing a webinar with a managing director from BlackRock and another managing director from Temasek, which is the biggest sovereign wealth fund in Asia. And we're talking about the massive opportunities in Asia for decarbonisation and the roles BlackRock and Temasek are playing. You would not have seen either of those two financial institutions talking about this 18 months ago. Now they're absolutely leading the world in the space. Now, pivoting back to India for a minute, and possibly to me, one of the most exciting announcements I've actually seen came from India's Reliance Industries. Now, that's the richest man in India. Mr. Ambani pledged net zero emissions for Reliance Industries by 2035, and his target is to invest $10 billion in manufacturing industries across India for decarbonisation in the next 3 years. And that is 100% aligning the biggest company in India with Prime Minister Modi's target for 450 gigawatts of renewables by 2030. And when the largest oil and gas company in India makes a pledge of zero emissions by 2035, that's got seismic implications in its own right. So I'm just trying to stress to you the implications of these global giants moving. It will have profound implications on the world for the positive. It'll also have profound implications on Australia, irrespective of the political intransigence down in Canberra. And so I just reiterate, to me, the forecast that Australia, the opportunities for Australia to become a renewable energy superpower, as the famed economist Ross Gunnow has talked about for many, many years, to me, that is a vision that is now absolutely clearly on the horizon. And it's probably unusual for me to be calling out a billionaire in Australia as doing good, but I have to mention Twiggy Forrest's road to Damascus moment in the last 12 months has been a breath of fresh air. When the richest man in Australia commits to being all in on decarbonisation, when Fortescue Mining commits a net zero emissions target of 2030, and they are on track this year to spend $600 million just in the next 12 months on developing decarbonisation strategies leading from green ammonia, green hydrogen, green iron. that's probably makes Fortescue the single biggest investor in those decarbonisation technologies in the world. And Twiggy Forrest is moving Fortescue at an unbelievable pace of knots. So I just love the fact that 2021 has seen a race from the richest man in India versus the richest man in Australia to decarbonise their businesses as fast as they possibly can. Get out of the way, it's going to happen. So with that, I'll stop there and be delighted to take questions after we hear from Gabrielle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. There was so much there, so many numbers for us to process. One of the things that I took away from that is just the amount of money that is going into this space. We can't even comprehend how much money is going into this space. Another thing that I took away from it is just the amount of global momentum and also the stark contrast that Australia is in terms of not even being present. I mean, you know, it feels like we're not even at that table. You know, we're not even getting the crumbs off that table. So we've got businesses that are getting involved in this and you know, millionaires, billionaires getting involved in this, but we don't even have our political representatives getting on board and seeing the opportunities that we're missing out on. And like you say, you know, that term renewable energy superpower, and that was coined some time ago, and we could have been on the path to that, but we haven't even taken that on board. So thank you so much for your time. Now we can talk. So this is Dr. Gabrielle Kuiper, and she is a distributed energy resource specialist at IEFA. She's a guest contributor there. Dr. Gabrielle Kuiper is an energy, sustainability and climate change professional with over 20 years experience in the corporate world, government and non-government organisations and academia. She was previously the distributed energy resource strategy specialist with the Energy Security Board. Prior to that, Dr. Kuiper held senior executive or senior advisory energy related positions in the Office of the Australian Prime Minister, at the Public Interest Advocacy Centre and in the New South Wales Government. We look forward to hearing what Dr. Kuiper has to say about distributed energy and its role in the Australian market. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Annalise, and thank you so much to We Are Hughes for hosting this event. It's fantastic to have the opportunity to talk with you and to follow the two Tims. I'm going to bring things down to some really tangible things about what's happening in terms of energy. My history with climate change dates back to 1992, when I heard about what was then called the enhanced greenhouse effect. Heard about it at a public talk, and I thought, could be a conspiracy theory, but it seems like it's logical. If you add more greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, then that blanket of gases that's surrounding the planet will eventually result in changes to the climate. That's quite a long time ago now, 1992. But at the same time, I started reading about these futuristic technologies of wind and solar. People were just starting to really develop wind and solar. And I want to talk about the good news about how they've developed in sort of the last 30 years. Just a bit of a energy 101 in case I get too technical. So the normal terms, the way people talk about the electricity supply chain is you start with generators. These can be large or small scale, used to be coal and gas, now much more wind, solar and hydro. They go through your big poles and wires, which is the transmission network, to the small poles and wires, which is the distribution network, and then to people's homes or businesses. So I'll be talking about each component of that supply chain as we go through and about how it's changing. But I thought I'd put that up there just so people had a ready reckoner to some of the terms I'll be using. So the fantastic news is, despite sort of the last few years of federal government inaction on climate change, is that as Tim Buckley has said, the world is moving, global financial markets are moving, and in fact, there is a massive 1 in 200 year energy transition already underway, including in Australia. So coal is already being replaced by solar and wind. This graph just shows the large scale exits of coal, the big one in 2016-17, that was the exit of Hazelwood in Victoria. And then this is the new wind and solar coming into the system. Another way to look at that is this graph here, which shows that while we still have a large amount of coal and unfortunately gas in the system, that solar and wind is coming through more and more. This one is my favorite case study if you ever get depressed about how little is happening on climate change. South Australia went from having no renewables 14 years ago to having 60% last year. And they have periods of time where 100% of the electricity supply in South Australia is from the combination of solar and wind, and they have no coal. They still have some gas, that's an issue, but that's a phenomenal speed of transition. And we're only at the beginning of this massive energy transition. So at the large scale, there are plans for a whole series of what's called renewable energy zones. So these are areas that have been identified as having great solar resources, great wind resources, and also the potential for hydro or pumped hydro resources. That also, obviously, batteries you can put anywhere. And New South Wales has got 3 renewable energy zones. You can see there, New England, the sort of central west, and then the southwest. New South Wales is actually very fortunate to have Minister Matt Keane, who has been progressing the development of renewable energy in New South Wales apace. He's putting a huge amount of energy in to ensuring that there will be renewable energy jobs, there will be renewable energy development, and there will be a really sunny and windy future driving economic development in New South Wales. To go with these big new solar and wind farms, you'll need a lot more large-scale transmission power lines. And in fact, we need to be careful here that we're not spending too much on these large-scale power lines, but some will definitely be needed. And I wanted to just give you that picture of what's happening at the large scale before I go on to my focus, which is really what's called the small scale. I'll say it's small but mighty. And this is where household, consumers and businesses come in. So to the end of last year, households had spent over $4 billion of their own capital. Probably some people on the webinar today have got solar on their roofs. And of course, that was very expensive when it started out. Nowadays, you'll get a solar system on your roof paying back in 4 or 5 years. The prices of the panels and the inverters have dropped so much. But the important point being that what we've ended up with now, if you can see from the graph on the bottom, is actually almost twice as much solar in Australia is on people's rooftops as in large-scale solar farms. So if you combine all of those rooftops across Australia, you get the biggest single generator in the national electricity market. As Tim said, there was over 3 gigawatts last year. The commercial and industrial sector, so this is your Woolies and your IKEAs and your Bunnings, they're all now starting to put solar on the roof as well. And so we're going to continue to see great growth in rooftop solar. And this is really exciting because there's benefits not only for the household or business, but for the system as a whole by having all of this distributed renewable energy. In fact, Australia is really leading the world in decentralized energy, partly because we've got such a fantastic solar resource and also because of the economies of scale that we've had so much solar development here. So that all of the companies that put solar on roofs are really cost effective in how they go about things, and we've got planning rules that have really helped facilitate it as well. So this graph shows that by 2040, for example, 45 or even earlier, if you take like 2035, almost half of electricity supply in Australia could be from these decentralized sources. Now, as I'll come to, that's not just rooftop solar, but battery storage and electric vehicles and the like. Another sort of really heartwarming sort of factoid to remember if you get depressed about climate change is that South Australia set an absolute amazing world record late last year. They had the only place in the world that this has ever happened, having 100% of electricity supply for, you know, over 1 million people just from sunshine. So, and 2/3 of that, over 2/3, the 77% was from people's own rooftops, and the rest was from large scale solar farms. There wasn't even any wind that was involved there. And what's really positive is that the new head of the Australian electricity market operator, the people that basically operate the electricity system, is that they have said that by 2025, they'll be able to handle any time there's 100% renewable energy generation in any state in the national electricity market. And once they can do it for instantaneously, then they can do it for 1 minute, then they can do it for 10 minutes. And then before you know it, we'll be able to be a place with 100% renewable energy generation. Obviously, there are places in the world like Iceland and Norway where the vast majority of the electricity is already generated from hydro, which is also renewable. But being able to have stable and secure electricity supply from wind and solar, which vary according to the weather, that will be quite unique in the world. And our IEFA colleagues around the world are always interested to hear what's happening in Australia, because we are quite far ahead of most places around the world. Right, so mobile batteries or batteries on wheels. You might have heard of people talk about electric vehicles, but really I like to think of them as batteries on wheels. I also heard them referred to recently as smartphones on wheels. Really, your electric car or motorbike or bicycle or your electric bus is becoming part of an electricity system, and it's going to be able to be easily updated in terms of its software, just as your mobile phone is able to be easily updated. This is really transformational, bringing together the transport plus the electricity plus the storage plus the smarts that go with it. And again, this is another case where you can't underestimate the pace of change here. Some of the people on the webinar may have heard about Tesla's Gigafactory in the US, where they're, I think it's several $billion worth of investment in a battery factory. That's only one of several worldwide. Basically, China, Korea, and Japan are all trying to outdo each other on battery manufacturing. And that's fantastic, because that means the costs continue to fall. Andrew Constance, the New South Wales Transport Minister, has become a huge convert to electric vehicles, which is fantastic. If you want to buy an EV, you can now get a $3,000 rebate. You can also get up to $9,000 for retrofitting a battery to a solar system. I think we need to make those more equitable. You need to get more for an electric vehicle, but it's a great start. My favorite, Tim Buckley's heard this probably half a dozen times already in the last month, but my favorite anecdote of the moment is about how electric vehicles can assist in unexpected ways. So the City of Newcastle installed a big solar farm basically at its municipal waste dump. And now they're buying electric garbage trucks. So the electric garbage trucks not only can go and dump their load at the municipal waste depot and recharge there. But the size of the batteries in the electric garbage trucks is such that the City of Newcastle have already planned that they will be able to provide emergency power supply in the event of any adverse climate event. So whether it's bushfires or floods, they'll be able to send their fleet of garbage trucks out to whether it's the local community hall or wherever to be able to provide resilient power supply. And I think that's just such a perfect anecdote of how the technology is changing, and you can get multiple benefits. You get the emissions reduction, you get the adaptation, and you get the combination of providing community services in a variety of ways from this new technology, if we, have the smarts to be able to do that. The other thing to know about electric car battery is that it's sort of 6 to 10 times the size of your average kind of power wall, those sort of stationary batteries that you can see. And so they can provide, if you were to say charge your car during the day with solar from your roof, you would never be able to basically use all of that electricity overnight. So there's a lot of concern about, well, you'll run out of electricity supply. But at the moment, there is huge capacity already, and that capacity in the batteries is growing, obviously, as the costs fall. So there's a lot of potential for solar and electric vehicles to partner together. I won't go into great details about this, but I've already talked about electric vehicles being smartphones on wheels, and that really goes to this issue of digitization. So everything being on the internet and able to be controlled, and enabling smart charging, smart discharging of vehicles and the like. And this can also apply to appliances in the home. So one of the things we've been working on recently at IEFA is to try and get smarter appliance standards. So for example, with your air conditioner or your hot water heater or your pool pump or your electric vehicle charger, to have a demand response standard so that you can turn up or others can turn up or turn down those appliances in order to change the amount of demand at the with the changing supply. So some people on the webinar might be familiar with the concept of off-peak hot water. So coal-fired power stations running 24 hours a day have traditionally had a lot of excess supply available overnight. So off-peak hot water was developed to soak up all of that excess supply that was available overnight. Now, what we want to do now is do the opposite. We want to soak up all the abundant solar during the day. So we need to have really smart appliances to help us do that. But wait, there's more. What we also need to do is get everyone off gas. And that means electrifying everything. Not so much of an issue in New South Wales, but in Victoria, as people would know, the vast majority of heating is through gas. The vast majority of hot water use is through gas. So we need to convert people's homes and obviously businesses to all electric. The great thing is the technology is also available to do that now. So induction cooking will give you just as good quality cooking experience for a fraction of the price as gas. I took this photo in a museum in London. I'm not sure we'll all have solar panels on our shirts, but I thought it was a great example of how, electricity generation is being woven into the very fabric of our lives. Listen to a great podcast about how electric vehicles, the next generation obviously, are going to have solar panels embedded, and you could potentially go for kilometers on a nice day without using the battery at all, because you'd be running off the solar panels in the roof. I just snuck this slide in here while I was looking at the chat while the Tims were speaking, because someone asked about jobs. really important thing to note is that there's a huge amount of jobs in particularly rooftop solar installations. So you can see almost 10,000 jobs across Australia, smaller number of jobs in large scale, but there's obviously a huge amount of jobs related to all of the developments that I've talked about. So to sort of sum it up, in terms of what I've been trying to say about distributed energy resources, what's great about something like rooftop solar is that you're placing the electricity panels in the location where the electricity is going to be used. We've got falling costs of everything: solar, batteries, EVs, smart appliances. Through these processes, we can balance the variable solar and wind supply with variable demand and the smart appliances. And there's huge potential, given the size of batteries and electric vehicles, to help use them to help manage the system. So really, from my point of view, the future is really that solar plus storage, whether it's on wheels or static, and the smarts to help manage the system. So thank you very much. And I saw some really interesting questions coming through in the chat, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much to Gabrielle. What I took away from that is that Australia is rooftop solar leaders, and that other countries are looking to us to see how that will work, you know, as rooftop solar gets more and more into their energy grids. I'm really excited about the renewable energy zones, especially along the east coast of Australia. And I would never have thought, I would think that garbage trucks could come to the rescue in times of crisis. But I did see someone say that maybe we need electric garbage trucks down at the tip that we have in our at Lucas Heights, is it? Lucas Heights tip. We need an electric garbage truck and wind turbines on the ridge so that we can take advantage of this. Thank you so much, Gabrielle, for your insights and all that fascinating information. I sort of more at the micro level about what's happening in Australia and how also, you know, some very achievable things that we can do, how we can, you know, get on board and join the electric revolution or the green revolution. So we're going to hand it over to any questions. I'm just going to spotlight all our, so if we've got any questions, Josh.
Yeah, so we do. We have quite a few. I think quite a lot of them could be open to all of our speakers today. So I think I will just ask them generically, and if you feel like you are the one that wants to comment on it, or we all comment on it, that's fine. So the first question is asked by Lorraine: how do you feel about calls for net zero by 2050? Is that realistic? It feels like offsetting is another way to slow down radically reducing or sequestering carbon.
Do you want me to have a go at that, Annalise?
That'd be great.
Yeah, it'd be good. Sorry, my line dropped out there. I've just come back on, so I missed a little bit of the last conversation.
You can watch it again.
Yes, I will. Yeah, thank you. Look, if you look at the concentrations of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere and then the projections of when we'll reach certain thresholds, it's pretty clear that we will hit 1.5 degrees by the 2030s, probably the early 2030s, so not very far away. And to be able to stay within 1.8 degrees of warming, so that's beyond 1.5 degrees, close to 2, which is probably the best we can do at the moment, we need to completely decarbonise by 2035 or thereabouts now. So 2050 is way too late for that. So we need much swifter action than was previously realised. In terms of offsetting, I mean, I'm not such a fan in the new era, really. I think what we need to do is both cut emissions and draw some gas out of the air at the same time. If we can do that at scale, we can get back down to 1.5 degrees, 1.5 degrees. but it's a very, very big task. And, you know, we need to start right now with those very deep cuts in emissions and have the job done by 2035 if we're really to have a hope of staying, you know, below 1.8 degrees.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I'll jump in with a different perspective, but I totally agree with Tim's conclusion. The Paris Agreement was all, in my view, all about the common but differentiated responsibilities globally. And so when we think about Australia, we're a developed country. We've been one of the key beneficiaries and one of the key causes of climate change and carbon emissions over the last 100 years. And countries like India and Mexico and the emerging markets in the main have not contributed anywhere near a fraction of the damage that the OEC has done to our atmosphere. So the Paris Agreement was all about the common but differentiated responsibilities. We caused the problem. India and the emerging markets are happy to help solve the problem, but only if we help fund it in their countries. And so I'd also say, therefore, it's absolutely critical that we move well before 2050 so that we can buy some time for the emerging markets to actually deliver by 2050. So that means Australia, absolutely, as Tim said, we have to move by 2030, 2040. And so I think it's total negligence on behalf of Australia not to be acting at absolute record speed right now.
And just to add on that, because you've got the moral case there. I think what's really interesting is that we spent so long talking about how some people might remember the debates about $100 roasts and Whyalla was going to be wiped off the map. There was so much fear mongering about the economic damage that would be done by reducing emissions. What's, I think, really turned around in the last 2 or 3 years is the clarity of how much money there is to be made and how much jobs can be created by moving ahead, because this is a technological and commercial transition. And Tim Buckley also outlined how much global finance is moving. So there's a massive economic opportunity, and also if Australia doesn't move fast enough, the countries that do fully appreciate the moral case will penalise Australia in some form or another, or simply investors that find the Australian government position too difficult will leave. So if any of you are with PowerShop, the retailer, that's owned by Meridian, which is owned by the New Zealand government, and they're a renewable energy developer. They're thinking about exiting Australia because of the difficulty of the federal government. So you'll just end up not only with all of the horrific effects of dramatic climate change that we're already seeing in Australia, but that will be compounded by some economic impacts. Tim and I were talking earlier today about Australia potentially being a dumping ground for old internal combustion engine vehicles because we don't have good fuel efficiency standards. And why would you sell electric vehicles into Australia when you can sell them to any other market in the world and have greater government support for it? Yeah, so there's absolutely the moral case and the economic case here.
Thanks to all our panelists. All interesting how everyone has, you know, the same goal, but such different perspectives. And thank you for bringing all your expertise. Do we have any other questions, Josh?
Yes, I'm going to combine two at the moment. One is talking about their investment portfolio is primarily super, obviously, as most of our investment portfolios are. They've traded it to an ethical package that takes climate impacts into account. Are there any real changes in how that is being done? And also, what are your thoughts on individuals investing in renewables? And are there any companies in particular that are doing this well?
Any takers?
I'm thinking that's an IEFA question.
We're looking at each other. Who's going to take it?
It's all you, Tim. Professional financial analyst.
We don't have to call out any companies. We can just say if it is being done responsibly or not. I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to get off mute and also just get my clarification right. So I missed part of the question, Josh. But firstly, I'll say, because I work on India and Australia as my two key markets. In India, IEFA is encouraged by the Indian government and Indian laws to do public interest financial research. In Australia, it's illegal to provide financial advice as a financial expert if you don't have a financial license. And because we're not selling anything, we can't get a financial license. So we are holding ourselves out to be financial analysts, and we're not actually regulated or allowed by ASIC to do so. So I was giving a legal answer. We're not allowed to provide financial advice, and particularly in the Australian market. And it's a quirk that a journalist can talk and answer that sort of question. They have a public interest exemption, which is great. But yeah, certainly IEFA, we can't give financial advice. But what I would highlight is the risk. We can talk about financial risks, and that is something we talk about all the time. And we can talk about the sector overall. There is huge money being invested in the industry globally. In Australia, picking up on a point Gabrielle mentioned, there is some capital flight from Australia, and to me, it's accelerating. It is a key risk that you invest in Australian renewables against the policy of the Australian government, and you are very exposed to a whole lot of risks that don't occur in other countries. And so we are seeing global capital flight. We've also seen a number of key Australian renewable companies taken over. And so, for various reasons, I won't call any particular companies out. If I got most of the question off.
Thanks, Tim.
I completely understand that. Yes, I didn't want you to do that. Possibly a more political question, which Professor Flannery, you might be more interested in this one. The Nationals have been split on climate change. Many farmers are for change, but many Nationals are fully against. What is driving this, and how important is it?
Look, I will have a go at that, Josh, because I've had some personal experience with it. I think there's a couple of factors at play. One is the massive influence of the coal lobby, particularly in places like Queensland. And, you see again and again ministers for resources leaving Parliament and then becoming a chair of a board of a fossil fuel company, or taking up some other position in a fossil fuel lobby group or whatever. So there's clearly a bit of a link there between politicians and the fossil fuel industry. But secondly, I really blame the Canberra kind of atmosphere. It's the kind of echo chamber that is that massive house on the hill lets people believe their own bullshit. It's very hard to get cut through with a different narrative. And when you've got that small group of Nationals talking to each other, reinforcing each other in a sort of an echo chamber, with online materials that suit their cause, it's very hard to get any introspection, any kind of thoughtful discussion at all. So they're two of the big factors, I think, that are explaining it. But you're quite right that, out there in the countryside, boy, the farmers, they watch the climate like nobody else. They know it's changing. They know there are problems, and they really want the issues addressed, and they want a price on carbon. I mean, the National Farmers Federation has come out saying, please give us a price on carbon so we can start doing things that we need to in terms of decarbonising our agricultural economy. But the government isn't listening.
Just a point on that. This is a good time to plug another event that we're having in a couple of weeks. We're hosting the latest documentary, The Big Deal, which absolutely touches on this point. And it's by Craig Rucastle, and it features Christian Van Vuren. And our event will have Zali Stegel come and talk about the influence that this, this issue has, coal lobbyists and the, integrity issues that are happening in Parliament in relation to climate change and climate inaction that we're seeing in this country. So just a little plug there. That's on the 1st of October. All right, got any other questions, Josh?
Yes, so there is also one here that I don't think has been answered. What are your comments about the stories about energy retailers wanting to charge homeowners that export excess electricity back into the grid?
I told you they'd ask this question.
That might be an IEFA question as well.
Yes, so there's been a lot of publicity about the so-called solar tax. It's a very complicated issue technically. Long story short, hopefully it will never happen because there's been such a big outcry from solar owners about it. And there's a lobbying organisation called Solar Citizens. If anyone's got rooftop solar or wants to get involved with them, they're very effective advocates. But one of the things that is important to know is that what we want to see happen is to have opportunities for households to earn money, not only just ordinary exports from your solar system, but from doing all of the demand response, turning up and turning down appliances and the like. And so far there's been very slow progress on that. But electric vehicles and batteries will assist with that. It's one of those things where it's probably hard not to go into too much extraordinarily and boring regulatory detail. But one of the things, maybe just to finish on a positive note on that, is a lot of the electricity distribution companies are getting, so your local poles and wires companies are getting a lot smarter. There was lots of fear mongering when solar first started coming into the system. We'll have lots of blackouts. There'll be reverse flows through substations, and it's not going to work. The fact is that there are parts of Sydney, some of the new suburbs in the northwest, where 100% of houses have solar on the roof, and the system works fine. Older parts of the grid does require some adjustment, but the good news is that it isn't, so far, hasn't required a huge amount of expense. So when you see sort of publicity about solar causing all these problems on the grid, it's kind of been blown out of all proportion, and that, you know, feeds a narrative about we can't have a reliable electricity supply with renewables. But we've had the new CEO of the Australian Electricity Market Operator in his first public speech say we're committing to being able to manage 100% instantaneous electricity supply by 2025. So, you know, it's easy to fearmonger about new technologies. The same thing happened when, favourite little anecdote, the origin of the red flag is in fact when cars were first brought out in parts of the United States, someone had to walk in front of them waving a red flag because they were dangerous, right? And so that happens with a lot of new technology, and then people realize that develop systems to be able to work with it, and everything will be okay.
Thank you. Very reassuring, thank you. All right, how are we going for questions? We might have a couple more, yep.
Yeah, I think I've got two more, if that's okay.
Yep, that'd be perfect.
What year do you think the deadline is for zero emissions? The last IPCC report said 2050. Do you believe that's still correct, or should that be moved a lot closer?
Can I just jump in again? I'll just really reinforce what I said earlier. You know, the best science is telling us that to have a 2/3 chance of staying below, 1.8 degrees, we need to see the global burning of fossil fuel stop by about 2035. So of course, if we make big inroads earlier, then you've got a little bit longer with the tail, but they're basically the figures. And the sad thing about this is the climate system doesn't care about us. It doesn't care about equality between nations. It doesn't care about the pace of technological change. It simply responds to the volume of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So, this is why I keep on talking about the need to decarbonise, get on an emergency footing, the need to get drawdown sorted so we can be drawing down gigatons of CO2 that we've put up in the atmosphere. We need to be taking this on at a holistic level. And of course, we need a big emergency room for all of the problems that are coming down the pipeline at us, from rising sea levels to heat waves to mega fires and whatever else. This is front and centre for government. And unless it becomes that, the climate system will simply switch over into a new and hostile state.
That's right. I mean, so there's been a lot of talk, a question from me, I suppose, is there's been a lot of talk about, the aging coal-fired power stations in Australia, for example, and how, they can operate until 2045 and then we'll switch them off. What's your assessment on whether those dates that they give are actually going to happen, or whether they will possibly be pulled forward because of changing economic situations like coal price, or, just no more? There's a current call for a moratorium on fossil fuels. So, if something like that gets off the ground, what are sort of the potentials here for Australian energy market? Can you unmute?
Sorry, I was replying to a question.
That's okay.
Passion got distracted. Can you repeat the question?
It's just about the aging coal-fired power stations and the talk about them, finishing the production at 2045, for example, and whether that's a realistic time frame, or whether it will be pulled forward because of other. No,
it will inevitably be pulled forward. Because it will simply be too expensive for them to operate. It's actually the thing about sunshine and wind is that they are free, whereas coal is expensive. You have to mine it and transport it to the power station. You have to run the power station with a lot of staff comparatively. And the price of wholesale electricity generation is dropping because, of course, it costs almost nothing to generate from solar or wind plants once you've built them. So, I wouldn't want to put a date on when all coal plants will have exited the national electricity market. But it's one of those things where I think it will happen far faster than anyone currently thinks. I would be surprised if we see significant coal export exits in this decade by 2030. I would be amazed if we had any coal in the system by 2035, 2040, because it just won't be economic.
Can I follow up on that answer? Because it actually answers another question. If there's no coal, how is there much analysis being done on transitioning to renewable jobs for those workers?
Yeah, good question. So bits and pieces of analysis. I think the majority of the jobs are, of course, in the coal mining for coal exports, as opposed to the workers at power stations. There are, some, but that's there, and it's important, obviously, that those people are given some sort of just transition, but particularly the workers in coal-fired power stations are generally older and bordering on retirement age at this point. In terms of workers in coal mines in New South Wales, a lot of those jobs won't be able to be replaced with as high paying jobs, but in terms of development of new jobs, I showed you the figures for renewables. There's green steel, there's hydrogen, there's retrofitting people's homes so that they're more energy efficient, there's electrifying homes, there's huge job creation potential, obviously, from the energy transition. Another related point on this is that there's quite a different economic situation in the Hunter compared to the Latrobe Valley. the Hunter has a number of other, very important industries, whether that's horse breeding or agriculture or vineyards, tourism. And so even if all the coal mines in the Hunter were to shut down, the region would still, the modelling shows, be okay economically. However, the Latrobe Valley is relatively economically depressed even at the moment. And the Victorian government have been very conscious of this and have been spending the last several years looking at how to support the energy transition in the Latrobe Valley. Hope that helps.
I might jump in as well with a slightly different answer, but building on what Gabrielle said about the probability of coal plant closures, and they're bordering on engineering comments, and I'm a finance analyst, but at the end of the day, coal plants are designed to run 60, 70, 80, 90% of the time. The economics work at 80% of the time. When you have free power for 8 or 10 hours of the day from solar, and the biggest question that AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, is trying to grapple with is what happens when we have negative demand, because solar has absorbed all of the demand on grid, just rooftop solar, let alone utility solar, then the power plants, the coal power plants designed to run 80% of the time cannot operate. They're not commercially, engineeringly, or economically viable. You can't ramp them up. They take hours and hours. You can't turn them off. And so you effectively have the technology from last century trying to support a modern grid of 2021. So ignore decarbonisation. They're not commercially viable in their own right. And then the other delusion that our federal government has latched onto as though it's a fact is that coal plants have a 50-year life. Now, they have a design life of 40 years. In India, they have a design life of 25 years. This delusion that they operate to 50 years without a massive capital investment is delusional. And we saw that in Western Australia. It's as though our federal politicians don't learn from history. Well, that's right. They don't actually read history, some of them. They can't read, maybe. Oh, sorry, that's getting a bit personal. But the Collie Power Plant, Western Australian government, a decade ago, spent $300 million retrofitting the Collie Power Plant, and within 3 years of turning it back on, it had a catastrophic failure and the plant closed. So they had to write off $300 million on one small power plant. Power plants don't reliably operate after 40 years. AGL has been trying to tell that to the federal government. It's cost them 2 CEOs already. It's cost them $9 billion of market value destruction, thanks to Josh Frydenberg and the federal government. How much billions of wealth does Australia have to lose before the federal government realising using technology from last century to solve a 21st century problem is really not going to help Australian consumers? It might help their promoters, it might help their donors, but it won't help Australia.
Thank you so much, Tim. I think we're out of time. I know Professor Tim Flannery needs to go to another event in 2 minutes. So if I can just quickly say thank you so much to Professor Tim Flannery, Dr. Gabrielle Kuiper, and Tim Buckley for being here tonight and for giving us your insights into what's happening, insights into climate change, insights into economics, and insights into the energy market. I have learned so much, some things to come away from. Must act now, cut those emissions, renewable energy superpower, and the one that I really liked is coal is already being replaced. So lots to be hopeful about. But if I can say sort of one thing to everyone who's here tonight, the biggest change, or the biggest thing that you can do to make climate action a priority in this country, is to vote for candidates who will make it a priority in your parliament. So I see our guest speakers are nodding there. It's absolutely the number one thing that you can do. We can make changes to our individual actions, but the biggest difference that we can make is voting in candidates who will make climate change a priority. So let's remember that at the next election. It should be in the next 6 to 8 months or so, and we can get someone for the electorate of Hughes who will make climate change a priority. So thank you again to our esteemed guests. Linda, just you may leave as you liked. I guess I know, Tim, you've got to go, but Linda would just like to say something about some events that we've got coming.
Can I just say briefly, Annalise, thanks so much for having me, but someone asked a question about, how do we combat the lies? The truth is that a good lie is going to will have spread across the country by the time that the truth's got its boots, laced up, as Samuel Clemens said. But, a good lie is also a flash in the pan. And if you stick with it and just just stick with the program, we will get there. I'm absolutely optimistic we will. Things are changing very, very quickly. So I don't want people to feel too depressed by what I said today. I was just trying to, tell it as it is. Yeah. But we can make these changes, I'm absolutely sure. And a big part of it, as you say, Annalise, is going to be getting the right people in our parliament.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. All the best.
Bye. Thanks.
I'm just going to get
Thank you.
Linda.
So much.
Where are you, Linda?
My little request, if you can hear me, is to take us off focus mode, put everybody on the screen, and I would like to get a photo of everybody all together.